You started your book with Jesse Jackson, which for you was writing history, but for me it was contemporaneous, because I did vote for him in '84 and '88. Now, I wasn't that political. I was working in public access cable TV, which was the citizen journalism of the day. And I'm sure you heard the story that Bernie actually registered as a Democrat to caucus for Jackson, and there was some...
Got spat on, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or
he got
slapped or spat on.
I think slapped.
That's
yeah.
right.
And
it's in his memoir.
Establishment people like to slap.
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering your take, because I'm sure you've interviewed Jesse Jackson. Did you ever ask him? Because I was so personally offended that he did not return the favor and endorse Bernie.
I didn't ask him that. And next time I interview him, I actually will ask that, because. And I guess that it wasn't that I consciously decided not to ask him that. It was more that, to me, like you said, he was a historical figure, and his person was almost less important than the movement that kind of grew up around him and then evolved from there. And so, to me, whether or not he endorsed Bernie in 2016 or will this time, was kind of beside the point, because I didn't really care about him as a person, but more as a person who did these groundbreaking things in the 80s.
But you knew that how hard Bernie worked for him and how
he was one of the few
essential
people
to Bernie's political evolution. He was. Yeah.
Right. And it's and you see these calculations being made all the time by people. I mean,
similarly, I'm going to go out of order, because this one definitely relates. But
and just to your point, I did talk to him about Trump, just to get his take on that, and he said two things that are interesting on that point. One is that he said, back in '88, if we had succeeded in democratizing the economy, there wouldn't have been any room for Trump. And I thought it was interesting.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that he went directly to the economy and talked about democratizing it. But then the other part that you're referencing came out, and he said, actually, Hillary Clinton did beat him. He won. He had more votes. She still had more votes. So
such an establishment
people can right. So he can say something so radically insightful.
Yeah.
And in the same sentence with like semicolon.
Yeah.
Say that actually we won.
See, it's interesting about Maxine Waters, because I did not realize until I read in your book that she co-founded the Congressional Progressive Caucus with Bernie.
And was a big Jackson person too, yeah.
Well, I assume that, but we ran into her at, and I don't know, Kim, if you were at Lila Garrett's 90th birthday party. So Lila Garrett, she hosts a radio show on KPFK called Connect the Dots, and she's been a long time progressive activist here in LA. So Maxine Waters showed up to honor her at her 90th birthday. So immediately, Mimi Kennedy and Dorothy Reich and a bunch of us progressives swarmed her to try to lobby her to endorse Bernie. And she sort of said, I ought to endorse Bernie. I really ought to. Like you could tell that she was struggling with it. So then after I became a delegate and we had a meeting in Long Beach for all the Bernie and Hillary delegates, she had endorsed Hillary by that point. I asked her, I said, and you'll be interested in her answer, I said, so how come you ended up not endorsing Bernie? And she said, he didn't get his young people out.
What?
And no, I have to say that from what I read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because I don't have the site right here, my understanding was that 70 to 90% of young people, and I'm not sure what demographic I'm talking about, maybe 18 to 25, supported Bernie, but only 20% of them went to the polls. So that was something we noticed when he was out here doing his rallies. He was, getting thousands, tens of thousands of people to his rallies over 3 weeks in May before our primary, but he never talked about how to vote for him. We had a horrible thing with the crossover ballot here, where if you were no party preference, you had to request a crossover ballot in order, and it was, so many people were disenfranchised. But Bernie was like all about giving the speech. That's what I say. Bernie gives the speech, and he wasn't into the nitty-gritty of to get people out. I mean, we came up with at LA for Bernie, I had a Facebook group called Drive 10 People to the Polls. And I was thinking of how we could do this as a contest, but then I had nothing to like reward them with, you know. I was actually called the campaign to see if we got somebody to drive the most people to the polls, would Bernie meet with them, you know. I was racking my brain trying to think of something that would motivate people to actually go vote. So what's your feeling about that? Do you have any statistics or any insight you want to share?
Well, there was, I mean, it goes...
Because it seems to me it's going to be crucial for 2020.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it also goes to the protest nature of his 2016 campaign, that he was very clear in the beginning that, you know, first he wanted Warren to run, Warren wouldn't run, and then he said, well, nobody will challenge Hillary Clinton, and it's not helpful to have a coronation.
Yeah.
There will be nobody out there. There will be nobody out there just making her talk about the ideas that I believe in. So he was very clear that the reason he was running his campaign was to get his ideas out into public and to try to push her to the left. And so if that's the way you're thinking about your campaign, then you're not thinking about the mechanics of actually winning votes.
But by the end, he sure was.
Yeah.
Right, but that's
something
too
flipped.
right.
And that's what I'm talking about, California.
Right, but it's like too little, too late kind
Yeah.
of. And old dog new tricks. Like he didn't have the people in place, and Becky Bond talks about this, that like the Clintons were so good at locking down the party structure
Yep.
that that's why, and we're lucky as a country in some ways that like it brought people who otherwise would not have gotten into politics, people like Rojas,
Yeah.
who was just a community college student, like Shroykot, who was
Tech
an engineer and a tech guy, and Corbin, who was literally a running
truck guy.
Yeah. And you know, so it opened space for them, but not necessarily because the campaign was like, what we need are like the most impressive, talented food truck people. It was like, we can't hire anybody else.
Yeah.
Like nobody who wanted a career in
Yeah.
Democratic Party politics was willing to work on it. Becky even said that vendors, like mail, like just the basic, like neutral-ish kind of vendors who weren't even working for the Clinton campaign would decline to do business with Bernie Sanders lest the Clintons find out that they're working with Sanders and cut them off in the future. It's like, but now the DCCC is like very public about what their policy is, but like it was no secret back then.
Yep.
And so as a result, you have this fast-moving campaign. You're barreling from state to state, and you just don't have the manpower. And also, the campaigns are like organized partly around crisis. It's crisis after crisis. Even if we don't think that there are crises from the outside, like inside the campaign, like, oh my God, this thing happened. We have to respond to it. And then proactively figuring out how to get people to most effectively and efficiently vote in the California primary is so far down on the list, and that there's no staff there.
Right. Well, that was the
certainly
problem.
Bernie's not going to.
Here's the thing, and let's just talk a little bit about Jeff Weaver and Tad Devine right now, because a lot of people don't know that Tad Devine, by the way, was the one who came up with the super delegates after McGovern. It's very democratic back then. They didn't have the right-wing noise machine, and I would love for you to watch the movie Heist if you haven't already seen it.
So good.
The Powell memo, you know, where they said
The Powell memo was
why Nixon is looked at as a liberal right now is because the right wing didn't have Fox News, it didn't have the think tanks, it didn't have the lobbyists, it didn't have the universities locked up. Koch brothers are actually buying professorships all over the place. And that's what the Powell memo said that they should do. So back then, you know, you have this example of Stennis and the money. I just love that anecdote where, you know, you talk about how it was supposed to be from big money to movement. But it wasn't even always big money, because that was what, 1982? Someone says he should go ask, I forget the name of the industry, for the money, and he says, you can do that?
Right, this is, so this,
you're right. It's totally
this is a guy who, I think he'd been in the Senate since the 40s. And so in 1982, after Reagan, you know, this John Stennis, Mississippi segregationist, white supremacist, he's facing, for the first time since then, a competitive general election from Haley Barbour, like 35-year-old Haley Barbour. And Yes, this consultant is sent in, and so this is part of the party, like rethinking like how it needs to do politics. He had never spent more than like $5,000 on a campaign in the past, and so they tell him, you're going to have to raise $2 million for this campaign, and you're going to run 30-second television ads, and the ads are going to show that you're vigorous, that you're alive. Because I think he was 83, 84. Like he was getting up. Yeah, you just have to show you're still a segregationist.
Holy shit.
Sorry.
You're still alive.
No, right.
Ryan, there's water if you want some. Right there. Ryan,
You're not doing
here's water if you want some.
Okay.
This is really good, by the way.
And so he says to the consultant, "It's $2 million. How could I ever raise $2 million?" And they say, "Well, you're the top-ranking Democrat on the Armed Services Committee. You oversee the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
Like you can. What about?" And he names the two of the biggest companies in Mississippi. What about them? And he says, "Would that be proper?"
Yeah.
And this is a hardcore white supremacist having this ethical dilemma.
Which is like the irony.
Yeah. And he eventually overcomes its ethical. And the consultant says that he walked out of the office and he looked back, and the old man was just staring at his hands at this dilemma that was before him. And he ends up raising the $2 million, putting the ads on television, and he beats Haley Barbour in the '82 election. And it's interestingly complicated by the fact that he wound up being one of the senators who voted against Ford. And he voted against making Martin Luther King a holiday. He was still a white supremacist.
Yeah.
Right.
Haley Barbour would have voted for Ford. So it's an interesting question. Would you rather have a white supremacist who is going to cast the right vote on Bork, or a white supremacist who's going to cast the wrong vote on Bork?
Well,
And so that was the question that these consultants would
Yeah.
say, like, well, this is why we don't need to radically kind of reshape the party. We just need to raise enough money that will get a slightly less bad white supremacist in the South,
Yeah.
and
Oh
be
my
a
God.
slightly less white supremacist party than the Republican Party. And as long as we keep raising enough money from Wall Street, the weapons makers, etc., then we can maintain parity with the Republicans.
Yeah, and well, you didn't talk about this very much, probably because, like you said, other people have written extensively about this, but when Bill Clinton pivoted to Wall Street, away from unions, that's
DLC.
when they stopped representing the working man. And the reason they stopped, it's like, why does Willie Sutton, when he was asked, why do you rob banks, because that's where the money is, unions have been so decimated, starting with, by the way, Jimmy Carter. You talk about that in your book, and I feel like not enough people understand what kind of president Carter was. They just remember his post-presidency, whereas neoliberalism and deregulation, really started under Carter. And but back to the TV. So Tad Devine decided to have the super delegates because McGovern lost so badly, and they thought, oh look, we've democratized the process, and now we've got Nixon. So he was quoted as saying in the Wall Street Journal, I looked this up, so that we don't get a Huey Long populist, demagogue, or a Norman Thomas socialist. So I looked up Norman Thomas, okay, and he's like exactly Bernie Sanders,
Exactly.
right? So Tad Devine, who gives this quote, is the one, so they got hoisted by their own petard with the super delegates, but also Tad Devine had an open-ended contract, and I spoke about this with Jeff Weaver, where he did not have a cap on his fee. So there was a conflict of interest. The more ads he bought, the more money he made. And when Bernie lost New York, they fired 291 organizers. And they came into California with only 50 organizers, whereas they had 100 in New Hampshire. And you talk about Bernie being notoriously cheap. I'm sure that was, part of the consideration. But there was a Politico article I remember reading where Tad Devine was thinking of spending, $2 million on TV ads, and was told, because they only had 6.9 million when they got to California, was told that would be really insufficient to blanket the whole state. And he said, well, maybe we'll just do field, and then he ends up buying the $2 million. So for $2 million, they could have hired back the 291 organizers, put them all over California, and won the largest delegate pool. So there were like a lot of mistakes made back then, but